About 2,500 million years ago, the tectonic plate of India split off from the west coast of Africa and drifted away into the open seas. India continued to drift north until it plunged under the belly of the Asian mainland, causing the most massive upheaval on the face of the planet. Today we set off again, leaving Lhasa to cross the center of ancient Tibet. The last leg of our journey will take us over several mountain ranges and intervening valleys before we climb into the Himalayas. Lhasa Bridge is covered in prayer flags to celebrate the birthday of the absent Dalai Lama.
If it is going to be bad, then I think we should advance our...
We have gathered here to say goodbye to Hari, the leader of our expedition.
And in that case, what Goutam can do is, you will...
It is a sad moment. Hari flew into Lhasa to join us for the last leg of our journey to Everest, but the sudden change of altitude has affected him badly, and he will not be able to continue. After a few words of advice, he falls silent, overcome by emotion. Hari climbed Everest in 1965, but has had to give up his dream of seeing the mountain again. A brightly painted rock carving of the Buddha bids us farewell as we head west. It acts as a friendly reminder of the Buddhist principle that there is nothing permanent in life, nothing we should cling to, including our dreams. As if to confirm this basic Buddhist principle, we experience several quick changes of weather. The thin air neither blocks nor holds the heat of the sun, so the temperature plunges as soon as clouds appear. hot sandstorm turns without warning into a frosty blizzard, followed by a sudden downpour. In Tibet, they say, you can experience all 4 seasons in a single day. The sky is clear and it is warm again. The Lhasa River has turned into the roaring Yarlong Sangpo, Tibet's principal waterway. I have met it many times before under different names. At this height, it is the highest river in the world and justly called Sangpo, the mighty one. Dropping an astounding 11,000 feet to fertilize the Indian plains, it becomes known as the great Brahmaputra, son of Brahma, the creator. But after merging with the Ganges to form the vast delta which flows into the Bay of Bengal, it takes the feminine name of Jamuna, goddess of fertility and rebirth. As we emerge from the gorge, we chance upon a planting festival. The season for growing crops is brief and often uncertain, so it is natural for farmers to pray for a good harvest. The festival is an ancient fertility ritual accompanied by music, singing and dancing. This old man waving his sword may be performing a rain dance or simply amusing the children. But the horsemen, leaning over to touch the ground, are clearly planting the first symbolic seeds of the season.
Stop the car. The camera is running. We have done 10,000 kilometers. 10,000? अरे उतार साले गाड़ी से अभी उतार पहले 10,000 किलोमीटर है उतारो
It is the 7th of July. What I take to be a routine stop turns into a celebration when someone shouts that we have traveled 10,000 kilometers since the start of our expedition. It has taken us just over 8 weeks to get from Samarkand in Central Asia to Shigatse in central Tibet. Shigatse is the country's second largest city. It lies in a broad valley near the junction of the Yarlong Sangpo and Nyanchu rivers. At the western tip of Shigatse, beneath Mount Dalmari, stands Tashilunpo, the fourth great monastery of the Yellow Hat sect. Surrounded by a modern Chinese suburb, Tashilunpo is a walled city within a city. We are greeted by the sound of voices singing in unison. I expected to see monks chanting, but what I find instead are men and women at work on a building site. Is this some relic of serfdom from Tibet's medieval past, I wonder, or the result of an uplifting faith? Tashilunpo is the ancient seat of the Panchen Lama, the second spiritual leader of Tibet. Panchen means great scholar. It is the title which the fifth Dalai Lama bestowed on his revered teacher when he accorded him divine status equal to his own. When a Panchen Lama dies, there is a search for a child who is thought to be his reincarnation, just like with the Dalai Lama. Since the 17th century, Panchen and Dalai Lamas have initiated one another as spiritual leaders, the elder acting as tutor for the younger. Relationships between the two were not always close, however. Over the centuries, there were many attempts by foreign powers to gain a foothold in Tibet by playing one leader against the other. Like the Potala Palace, Tashilunpo is a major tourist attraction, and we find the courtyard of Kelsang Temple filled with more camera-wielding Chinese than Tibetan monks. "50 years ago, Tashilunpo was the administrative center of Western Tibet. It had 4,000 monks in 4 separate tantric colleges, each with its own abbot. There are over 600 monks, including many young novices. Its quiet streets feel peaceful rather than desolate. Perhaps Tashilunpo's original purpose has not been totally forgotten. Their faith is supported by the hundreds of Tibetan pilgrims who rotate the prayer drums along the walls of Tashilunpo every day as they make the sacred clockwise circuit around the monastery. Travel fatigue and the giddy heights of Tibet have taken their toll on me. But I am captivated by the serenity of these rituals, and for a moment I am as unaware of my troubles as the pilgrims seem to be of theirs. For a millennium, Tibet was ruled by its mystics, men for whom the world was a mirage constructed in the mind. Flags move in the wind. What is it that moves, the flags or the wind? Neither, they would reply. It is the mind that moves. 14 miles south of Shigatse lies a small monastery famous for its psychic training and the extraordinary feats of its monks. Shalu Monastery produced long-distance runners called Lungompas, who were said to cross Tibet's vast spaces with superhuman leaps while in a trance-like state. They were employed as couriers before the British introduced their postal and telegraphic services at the turn of the century. Apparently, the lamas of Shalu could also raise their body temperature at will to ward off the cold. This feat, called tumu, was first described by the French Buddhist scholar Alexandra David Neal in her book Magic and Mystery in Tibet. The author claims to have mastered the technique herself after years of intense meditation. But, she says, that the aim of such meditations was not to become a miracle worker. It was to realize the subjective nature of all earthly phenomena and to achieve enlightenment. Gyantse lies at the head of the Nyanchu Valley along the ancient caravan route from India and Nepal. For centuries it was the center of the wool trade, Tibet's chief export, and the gateway to the outside world. It also lay in the direct path of any invasion from the south. The Dzong, or fortress of Gyantse, had managed to withstand previous attacks from Nepal, India and Ladakh, but finally succumbed to the British in 1904. Convinced that Russia and Tibet had signed a secret treaty which threatened the security of British India, the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, dispatched a diplomatic mission to investigate. It was led by Francis Younghusband, an imperial adventurer who single-handedly turned his expedition into a full-scale military invasion. In a series of one-sided battles, the British overpowered the Tibetans near Gyantse. The muzzle-loaded muskets and magic charms of the Tibetans were no match for the superior firepower of the British. In one 4-minute battle, 700 Tibetans were massacred. The rest walked away from the battlefield in sorrow and disbelief. In August 1904, Younghusband entered Lhasa in full-dress uniform, accompanied by a marching band. The inhabitants shouted and clapped in a final effort to drive out the evil spirits, but Younghusband was delighted by what he took to be an unexpectedly warm welcome. The Dalai Lama had fled to Mongolia, so Younghusband forced a friendship treaty on the hapless regent and withdrew, leaving his telegraph line and a trade mission in Gyantse. If the experience had undermined the Tibetans' faith in their protective deities, it served to encourage the mystic in Younghusband. Colonel Francis Younghusband devoted the rest of his life to good works and eventually founded the World Congress of Faiths. The Palkol Chode Monastery in Gyantse was founded in 1365. It once housed 1,000 monks. The 17 monks who now inhabit the monastery pass a large part of their day in meditation and prayer. Above the chanting hall, the sound of the monks' voices is echoed by the songs of the workers repairing its roof. Once again, I'm struck by the closeness of religion and daily life in Tibet, reflecting perhaps the unity of the internal and external world in Buddhism. There seems to be no division between the prayers resounding inside and the restoration work progressing on the outside. Even for the average Tibetan, life is a spiritual journey whose final aim is liberation from the woes of the world. The cosmic symbol of this journey is the mountain. Each person is on his own path and climbs in his own time from the lowest rungs of hell to the highest peaks of wisdom. The journey may take many lives to complete, but the starting point is always the present moment, from wherever one happens to be on the mountain. For me, the most spectacular structure in Tibet is the Kumbum temple, the multi-tiered pagoda built by Newari artists from Nepal in the 15th century. It contains 20 chapels, each dominated by a protective deity, and painted with elaborate murals. Pilgrims progress through all of them, ascending the stupa in a symbolic journey towards salvation. The dome is being restored, and much of it is hidden beneath the scaffolding. But finally, I discover what I have been looking for, the fabled all-seeing beneficent eyes. In India, these are placed on cars and boats, as well as temples, to ward off accidents and other misfortunes. In geological terms, the creation of the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau happened yesterday. These mountains are only 4 million years old, the youngest in the world. In fact, the movement of India is still forcing them up in places at a rate of almost an inch a year. It is the middle of July. We are approaching a highland pass on our way south towards the Himalayan range. Here, in the upper reaches of the world, I feel I am in the heart of Tibet. I can see the clear folds of the continental drift etched into the mountainside, and can almost imagine the cosmic collision that created them. After 2 months of living night and day with the same people, I feel like I'm traveling with a large family. There have been new friendships, love affairs, quarrels, everything you can think of. Whenever our caravan stops for a rest, each member of our group has something he likes to do best, whether it's basking in the sun or rolling a cigarette. But my favorite pair are Professor Thakur and Professor Zeng, our 2 geologists who can't resist taking out their pickaxes and chipping away at whatever rock face is closest to hand. Leaving our companions behind, the film crew drives ahead to the Lhasa Pala Pass, famous for its panoramic view of the Himalayas. From there we should get a good view of Everest, but Harry has warned us not to expect too much. Reinhold Meissner, the first climber to scale Everest without oxygen tanks, spent an entire month at the first base camp and never saw the summit because of the clouds. But we are in luck. At 17,000 feet we catch our first glimpse of the famous peak. Just as Harry had predicted, it emerges only momentarily from behind the clouds, and by the time the other jeeps arrive, it has already disappeared again. stopped for the night at Shigatse, also known as New Tingri, a village that lies in the shadow of a once great fortress whose foundations still perch majestically on the cliff top. From the highest post office in the world, I send letters to my wife and children. Next morning, our caravan of jeeps attracts the curiosity of a herd of sheep, clearly unfamiliar with the sight of modern traffic. In this remote corner of Tibet, where the land is buried in snow for most of the year, people are used to a life of hardship and isolation. Summertime is a festival.
Okay, just I don't think Goa you should be here. Okay, just try. How much try?
There's no eye for this. To the rear.
Simple pleasures are enjoyed wholeheartedly, and wherever we go in our strange caravan of jeeps, we are part of the amusement.
Oh, he's going so slowly.
Hey, Baba, please. Okay, now move.
Lying in a grassy plain, fed by the snow waters of the Himalayas, is the village of Old Tingri. Its inhabitants are mostly Sherpas, the mountain people who have always served as guides and porters for the Everest climbers. As always, we are greeted by the children, who appear as if by magic whenever we stop on the road, however briefly. Children have a special place in Tibetan life, for any one of them might be the spirit of some venerable old Lama returned to the world in a new body. Whenever a Dalai Lama dies, a search begins for his new reincarnation. The chosen one must possess certain physical attributes and mystical qualities which will distinguish him from ordinary mortals. These include the ability to identify the belongings of his predecessor or previous self. Reincarnated lamas are almost always discovered in humble households rather than the noble ones. The cynical might say that this is deliberate. to avoid one family claiming a hereditary right to the title, but I prefer to believe otherwise. Are not the humble in every tradition the ones most open to the truth? We stopped for lunch at the grandly named Everest View Hotel, a small inn with a typical Tibetan kitchen serving noodles and buttered tea. Wangdu is the one member of our expedition who speaks fluent Tibetan. In the restaurant, he talks to a young Sherpa who knows Mount Everest as Chomolungma, the mother goddess of the world.
What does Chomolungma represent? For the outsider, it is simply a mountain peak to conquer, but she is the mother of the world. The whiteness of Chomolungma can be compared to the purity of the enlightened heart and mind. At the foot of Chomolungma is a valley called Rongborang. There used to be many wild animals, like the snow lion and snow leopard, blue sheep, wild ass and antelopes. The vegetation used to be very rich. Once it was possible to extract coral. There are many kinds of flowers and many different kinds of birds. Because of this high altitude and solitude, there are many caves and places of meditation where ascetics have been in retreat for years. The Himalayas are like a monastery. The birds who come to the mountains are like the monks and nuns. The flowers are like the tinkling bells and symbols of the chanting hall.
The high passes of Tibet are always decorated with prayer flags. They are like open-air cathedrals where the faithful are enjoined to worship and pay homage to the natural wonders around them. When truck drivers reach the top of a pass, they invariably stop to perform a ritual of thanks. They stand by the flags clutching a handful of sacred verses, which they then release into the wind. Watching these blessings float off to the four corners of the earth, I feel the mountains are so near I could reach out and touch them. As we reach the top of the Rongbuk River, the entire horizon is filled with Mount Everest. Originally known only as Peak 15, its awesome height of 5.5 miles was first calculated by the Survey of India in 1852, using observations taken from the Indian plain. Legend has it that the survey director, Radhanath Shikdar, rushed into the Surveyor General's office and gasped, "Sir, I have discovered the highest mountain in the world." Peak 15 was eventually renamed in honour of the survey of India's founder, Sir George Everest. Rongbuk Monastery stands on an isolated cliffside in full view of the mountain. At 16,500 feet, it is the highest spiritual retreat in the world. This is where we will camp for the night. The monastery was destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, and for years its ruins were little more than a rubbish dump for mountain climbers. Now, there is a new stupa and a sufficient number of restored buildings to offer basic shelter and tea for travellers like ourselves. The first Everest expeditions all departed from Rongbuk after a month-long trek from Sikkim. They were organised by none other than Francis Younghusband, now President of the Royal Geographical Society. By the 1920s, the summit of Everest had replaced Lhasa as the supreme goal of romantic travellers, and Younghusband regarded the scaling of its height as a spiritual pilgrimage. The Tibetans, however, had a different perspective. Chomolungma was a sacred place, and to disturb its mountain spirits was believed to be a dangerous blasphemy. The monks tried hard to dissuade the first climbers, but to no avail. The 1922 expedition included John Knoll and George Mallory, considered to be the best climber of his day. They made 3 separate assaults, but the mission was aborted when an avalanche killed 7 Sherpas. The Rongbuk Lama performed religious ceremonies in memory of the dead Tibetans, one of which was intended to deal with the bad karma they had accumulated by attempting the climb. A second expedition was mounted in 1924. Armed with champagne, tins of quail in aspic, steel bottles of oxygen and leather waistcoats, they set off in the snow. Mallory and his young companion, Andrew Irvine, were nearing the top when John Knoll, filming them from below, lost sight of them. Other members of their party were driven back by blizzards, but they did not return, and their bodies were never found. Younghusband was convinced that they had reached the summit and died on the return journey. One will never know. For the Rongbuk Lama, the Mother Goddess had demanded 2 more human sacrifices. For the rest of the world, Mallory and Irvine had shown that the mountain could be conquered. Eight more expeditions attempted the north face before the Second World War. All were defeated by storms, avalanches, and altitude. On May the 29th, 1953, the New Zealander Edmund Hillary and his Sherpa Tenzing Norgay finally reached the top from Nepal. They were followed by the Swiss, the Chinese, and the Americans, and in 1965 by a team of 9 Indians, including Hari and Rawat.
On the same rope with me were 2 other men, Fuldorji, who is buried under the snow somewhere up there, and Hari, who has been disabled forever. I remember sharing my flask of tea with Hari at the 4th base camp. He said it was the best tea he had ever tasted. We were hit by an avalanche. It covered the entire camp and we lost our supply of oxygen. We didn't know what to do. But the next morning, Fudorji and Hari and I dug about in the snow until we found the bottles again. It was a miracle. We were young and we had a tremendous amount of energy.
The northern land of the world is Tibet, whence the doctrine of Buddha will spread. The summit of sky-touching snow is matchless insight without equal. The sun and the moon turning round its peak are meditation radiating wisdom and compassion. This is the valley of Milarepa, Tibet's great nature poet and its most beloved saint. Descending from the heights of the Himalayas, we pass through his valley on our way to Nepal. Here, he is said to have achieved perfect enlightenment, his example inspiring countless generations of lamas from the 11th century until today. He is famous for his songs of illumination, but when his disciple Gampopa asked for his last instructions, Milarepa replied, "What is needed is more effort, not more teachings." Then he lifted his cotton robe to reveal buttocks hardened by long years of meditating on a bare rock. "That's my last instruction, heart son," he said. "Do it." On the 20th of July, we reached Nepal. The summer monsoon has set in, releasing its downpour on the Nepalese side of the Great Mountain Barrier. The sight of so much lush greenery seems unbelievable after the dry expanses of Tibet. A scrap of verse floats into mind. Cursorily, we pass through all this world. Otherwise, each place is a world of its own. It is my goodbye to Tibet and our journey. Yet I feel the last words rightly belong to Hari, who inspired and organized our expedition. They are from the concluding passages of his autobiography, Higher Than Everest.
To the question, why climb a mountain? The famous mountaineer Mallory is supposed to have answered, because it is there. A good answer, but I wonder if it is quite complete. The experience is not only physical, it is also intensely emotional and even spiritual. The physical act of climbing a mountain has a kinship with the ascent of that inward spiritual mountain which everyone has to climb sometime or the other. But whether the mountain you climb is physical or spiritual, the climb will change you. It will teach you much about you and the world.